mention suffering comes oftentimes, and I'm forgive me if I don't get the exact quote right, but when the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves becomes insufficient in the face of our current circumstances, that's when suffering really occurs. And you draw that out, which I really did appreciate. When you got into the general story, the particular story which we tell ourselves, why is story such an integral part of understanding our suffering?
Well, if you think about what we are, Travis, we are people who must choose what we are going to do. The way that would be talked about philosophically is that we are agents. Mm-hmm. And it's not merely that we have the chance to do that, we must do that. If you and I don't choose to get up in the morning, then life is going to be pretty awful. And one of the things that happens when people get deeply depressed is that they quit choosing. They lose hope. They don't have a trajectory, something that they're after in the future. So what it means to be a human being is that you are somebody who chooses, hopefully pretty deliberately, what you're going to take to be good, what you're going to pursue as a good. Now, that pursuit requires a narrative. You have to have a sense of where you've been, where you're at, what it is that you want, and how you'll get there. Mm-hmm. One of my friends has a daughter who, from the time she was 7 or 8, had decided she wanted to be a pediatrician. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when I think she was 7, she got into a magnet school, and she came home and said to her folks, "I've worked for this my whole life." but she meant it in the sense seriously, that this was part of the trajectory that she wanted to follow. She right now is in one of the best hospitals in the nation as a pediatric resident. And so everything has gone pretty much the way that she thought it would go. In college, I'm sure it meant that there were many nights when she wasn't going to relax, wasn't going to have fun, but was going to work really hard so that she could get into a decent medical school. Once she was in medical school, she had to do something similar. She, for the first time, from what I understand, is actually dealing now with the fact that being a pediatrician is going to be pretty hard, because you see lots of things that are really disturbing. Children who have been abused in various ways. Many of the children are going to die of this or that. And so now, as she looks her way forward, as she thinks her way forward through her trajectory, she realizes that that what she's going to face is not going to be, what shall we say, the kind of bliss that she thought it was going to be. I'm just going to take care of really young children. That there are going to be hard things. Now, in knowing about those hard things, she, for the first time, has the chance to kind of reorient herself and say, you know, nothing in this life is ultimately going to satisfy me. The only thing that can satisfy me is my being in personal relationship with God through Christ. And that's what has to happen to all of us. And that's what suffering does. It isn't so much that suffering comes along when we already realize that life is inadequate. It's instead that very often suffering is what leads us to realize that life is inadequate. Maybe the best passage in all of Scripture on that is in Psalm 119, starting at verse 65. I actually wrote it down here because I thought it was so important. The psalmist says, "You have dealt well with your servant, O Lord, according to your word. Before I was afflicted, I went astray. You are good and do good. It is good for me that I was afflicted, so that I might learn your statutes. It is good for me that I was afflicted, so that," the purpose of my being afflicted was that I might learn your statutes. The law of your mouth is now, the psalmist is saying, the law of your mouth is now better to me than thousands of gold and silver pieces. Now the psalmist who wrote Psalm 119, I think, had to be very well educated and probably very wealthy, because that psalm is so intricately crafted that it took somebody who had a lot of leisure in order to get the thing right. And so he knew what wealth could do for him, and yet his suffering had taught him that there's something that is much more valuable than wealth. And so he goes on then, he says, I know, O Lord, in verse 75, that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. That's the picture. The New Living Translation, in place of before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word, says this, really rather marvelous. I used to wander off until you disciplined me, but now I closely follow your word. I used to wander off until you disciplined me, but now I closely follow your word. So suffering is very often God's way of being gracious to us and saying, look, at nothing in this life is capable of satisfying you. You need an infinite good, is one of the ways that C.S. Lewis would put it. And all the goods in this world are just false infinites. And so none of them are capable of satisfying you. And quite often it's only when the board is cleared of most of those false infinites that we then realize, no, we're looking for something else. We're looking for the only true infinite, who is God himself.